You're listening to WMBR in Cambridge. We're at 88.1 FM in the Boston area. We stream at WMBR.org. Playlists are posted in real time at track-blaster.com. You can get in touch with me by email, by sending email to newedge@wmbr.org. And you can get in touch with me by text message at 617-253-8810. And next up, we're going to listen to an interview with composer, animator, sound artist, many other things that will become clear as we listen to the interview, Brian Baumbusch. There is information about Brian Baumbusch at his website, brianbaumbusch.com, first name spelled B-R-I-A-N, last name B-A-U-M-B-U-S-C-H. You might want to check that out as you're listening so you have some background. But we'll give you some background in the course of the interview. Brian Baumbusch's new release is called Polytempo Music. The album releases on Other Minds, and we'll listen to some other work as well from Brian Baumbusch. And my guest is Brian Baumbusch. He's it says here, a multifaceted composer, instrument builder, musicologist, and software designer. Also says elsewhere, animator, musicologist. Did I say that? Yes, I did. He is, it says, and I think it's true, renowned for his pioneering contributions to the realm of polytempo music and cross-cultural collaboration. We'll talk about both of those, but we're also going to talk about a relatively new release, Polytempo Music. And welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I want to start off by just talking about polytempo music. The concept is clear. There are multiple tempos happening simultaneously. My question for you is, I guess, how did you develop an interest in that aspect of music, and also how does it work? I mean, there are definitely challenges in creating music where different tempos are happening simultaneously, and they're not necessarily evenly divisible by each other, right? We're not
Yeah.
talking about 2/4 and 4/4. So can you talk a little bit about polytempo music in general, and what drew you to that area?
Sure. Well, I would say, yeah, to first kind of define the term and unpack it a little bit. There's a similar term that is used in the context of a lot of music, which is polyrhythm or
Yeah.
polyrhythmic music. Um, and I would say that a polyrhythm is sort of one type of polytempo, because you could think of, polyrhythm could be something as simple as what you just said, like 4/2, right?
Right.
Some pulses happening 4 times the time of two, or 2/1, would be a simpler version of that. And you could think of those as two different tempo rates that are holding their rate constantly enough to have that sort of ratiometric relationship. But polytempo can get much more complicated than polyrhythm, which is more straightforward. So polytempo, let's say you had something that was still like two steady pulses, but they had some sort of irrational relationship, like
Right.
square root of 2/2. Uh, that's a tempo relationship that you could model. It would be beyond the realm of human perception to feel that tempo relationship in a natural and accurate way, but it could certainly be modeled, and in fact it was modeled by the composer Conlon Nancarrow in around the 1950s in one of his player piano studies, where he measured out the distance on a piano roll in order to create tempo relationships of two voices that had that irrational ratio. But even that is a simpler type of tempo relationship than, say, what if you wanted to have two different tempos, one that's speeding up while the other one is slowing down?
Mhm.
That's where things get yet a bit more complicated, because it requires doing calculus in order to understand what their relationship is as they progress through time. So again, Nan Carroll was one of the pioneers for a lot of those sort of early explorations into creating polytempo structures in music that went beyond the realm of simple polyrhythm. And the thing that was sort of the advent of how he started doing it was the reliance on using some kind of a machine. In his case, it was a player piano. And the reason you need a machine is because, again, it's sort of beyond the realm of human perception to just feel and recreate those rhythmic relationships accurately. So I got interested in Nan Carroll's music when I was in my late teens. I was exposed to a lot of music around that time because I went to the Interlochen Arts Academy, where I was, given a lot to sort of chew on. And then I went to Bard College for my undergraduate degree, where I studied with Kyle Gann, and he had only a few years before that published a book on Nan Carroll's works. So that was part of what got me interested. But I was also very interested in American minimalism at the time. So as my career started to progress as a composer, I wanted to find a way to, bring some of that sort of like complexity that you can get in polytempo rhythmic relationships, but color it in a way that is sort of more in the style of some of the American minimalists, which is like a soundscape that, and also let's say like a melodic or scalar shape or modality within the music that I find more appealing than some of like the late 20th century serialists who were, also exploring polytempo structures like Elliott Carter and so on and so forth. So the way I started to do it was to create click tracks that would embed these polytempo structures, and then have musicians in the context of live performance, each one following their own individual click track, uh, you know, have the ability to create polytempo music within a live performance context.
So is the way you structure your work polytempo work? And I'm sorry for actually confusing polytempo and polyrhythmic earlier, and I
I
understand
don't
the
think you,
well,
I don't think you did. You never even said polyrhythm, I think, or
yeah,
you kind of did, but yeah,
yeah,
a lot of
right.
people do.
But thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
But the question I have, I guess, is when you structure your work, is I don't know, the relationship between the multiple um, tempos, whether they're fluid or the tempos are fluid or static, um, is the relationship static? So, in other words, can they shift with respect to one another
Hmm.
once you've written the piece? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, um, I'm not sure that I understand what you're saying, but I
Uh,
think if, but yeah, yeah, say it again.
yeah. So, so
Yeah,
let's say you have two I don't know soloists,
yeah.
each doing performing in one way or another a melodic line, and they're performing using a different click track, a different tempo on their click track. Um, if you shifted the starting point of one relative to the starting point of the other, would your work still have be what you were looking for, or
Oh,
does the starting point, for example, need to be what you specified?
I see. Absolutely, the starting point needs to be specified because think about it as being sort of hyper synchronized music. Essentially,
Hmm.
it's what I do is I build this. I think of it as like a master clock
Hmm.
that is sort of a matrix,
Hmm.
and it has different branches to the clock, and one branch per musician. So the thing that they have in common is that the all of the gears of the clock start turning at the same time and
Okay.
end at the same time, and that creates the timeline of the music.
Hmm.
But within that, each voice, and in this new album Polytempo Music, there's several movements where all 12 instruments are all speeding up and slowing down in their own unique ways at the same time,
Hmm.
but I'm still keeping track of them having contrapuntal significance with respect to one another because I've done the math to see how their attack points all align. But
Gotcha.
yeah, it's It's very, very synchronized. The only thing that I could do on a global level to change it after the fact is very akin to what actually Nankara did, which is just to speed the whole clock up or
Hmm.
down.
Right.
Right? I could create like, yeah, and Nankara could do that by setting the speed of the pump essentially.
Yeah.
For me, I can do it in sort of my MIDI environment to create the playback and have it be globally faster or slower, which I did have to do in certain instances, having written this piece and then getting pushback from some of the musicians about how difficult it was.
Right.
That was the one of the things I could offer them. Well, we could just slow it down a bit.
Yeah, I can imagine you would get some pushback. So let's listen to a piece from this release, and we'll talk more about this release, which is not just a stereo album release, but also has other formats that are very interesting, interactive formats. So, but let's listen now to a non-interactive iteration or performance of this work. From my guest, Brian Baumbusch's release Polytempo Music, we're going to listen to the track titled Asden, A-Z-A-D-Z-A-N, Adzin. Any, you want to talk about the piece or anything about the piece before we listen to it?
I could, yeah, just say briefly. Adzan is the Muslim call to prayer, and it's using the Indonesian spelling. When I wrote that section of the piece and several other, about almost half of the whole 50-minute piece, I was in quarantine in Jakarta on my way to Bali, and it was a 10-day quarantine. So I was hearing the call to prayer throughout the day from the hotel the room that I couldn't leave for 10 days. Um,
Okay,
so that I'm always recalled back to that moment when I hear this music.
great. Well, we'll listen to it now. Adzin, from my guest, Brian Baumbusch, from the release Polytempo Music. We just heard from the release Polytempo music from, I guess, Brian Baumbusch, the piece called Oddsen. And um, I I want to talk to you a little more about the release itself and the multiple formats and the multiple opportunities that people have to experience this work. And I think, interestingly, it's available as an app um, for iOS and for
Android,
an Android, yeah.
and
Uh,
then it's also a VR, an immersive VR app.
so let's talk about those. How you came to implement this work in that way. I guess
Sure.
maybe talk more about so that people can get an idea of what they are and what they should
Yeah.
expect when they experience the work in that way.
Well, I just a little history. The first time I wrote a piece of music that was using polytempo structures was almost 10 years ago at this point. It was back in 2015. It was a piece I did for the Jack Quartet
Hmm.
and then this set of gamelan instruments that I built. And one of the things from the very beginning and in all of the pieces that I wrote since then using polytempo structures that I always really hungered for was the idea to of being able to hear the piece in different ways upon repeat listenings, because that type of music tends to be pretty dense, and certainly I leaned into the potential for density in what I've done in writing music with those structures, and it can be quite limiting in when compiled down to a fixed stereo recording. Of course, when you're in a live performance context and you can see musicians, that can help to open your ears to dance music, because even if you were to close your eyes and not be able to pick out what every voice is doing at a given time, you could look at, say the oboist or the clarinetist, and by seeing the gestures that they're making to play the instrument, that might open your ear to their voice, right? But knowing that I was going to create this piece first and foremost as a recording project, I really wanted to find a way to be able to hear the music in different ways. And I came up with the idea to spatialize the recording essentially. So I developed this interactive application. I used Unity, which is traditionally a game engine, a tool that's have been used by video game designers for a long time, but essentially to take this 12 recorded signals, or the recordings of the 12 instruments, which were all recorded separately, and to place them into a three-dimensional environment and localize the sound of each recording to like an individual virtual speaker, which then I animate around that 3D environment, thereby carrying the sound recording with it as it moves around. So when you listen in this interactive way, first of all, if you're doing it in VR, you can see these depictions of how sound is moving around you that looks like visible waveforms that are sort of the trails that the speakers leave as they're moving around. And you have this sense of being immersed in the music, but you can also then choose to move around the stage, and wherever you move will change the mix of what you're hearing based on the proximity that you have to various instruments. So I spent about 2 years developing this whole 3D album, as I think of it, as an immersive VR application, which is now published on the Meta Quest store. And then I spent about 6 months after that redeveloping the whole thing as a mobile application, so that you could still have a lot of interactive listening potential, but without needing to go out and buy a VR headset if you
Right.
don't already have one, which most people don't.
Um, so I haven't had the opportunity to experience this through VR, but I did download the app, and I mean it's incredibly deep and complex, and it's immersive in its own way, and of course it's allows you to interact with the music in a way that you obviously cannot when you're just listening to an album. Um, I do want to mention that if people want more information about what Brian has done or is doing, or about this release and the various ways to experience it, they can go to his website, brianbaumbusch.com, and that's spelled BrianBaumbusch. I had to look a little closer to my screen, make sure I got it
You
right.
got it.
.com. And so I think people would enjoy checking it out and checking out what we're talking about really in a little more depth. I want to play another piece also from the same Polytempo Music release. That's on the Other Minds label. Is that correct?
The audio only release is on the Other Minds label, and the
Right.
interactive apps are on my own new label, which is called Holography Records.
Okay. Um, this piece is called Hourglass. And again, do you have anything you want to say by way of introduction for this piece?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that of the whole album, there's really only two pieces that, by definition, are not polytempo, and that they could just be played with a conductor, and those are the two that you picked,
Say la
which
vie.
is fascinating. But yeah, well, Adzan is very it's very kind of sublime. It's very monophonic, and it's sort of this moment of peace in the middle of the piece. Meanwhile, Hourglass is the final movement, and the reason, I think most people listening to it wouldn't believe me if I said that it's not polytempo, because it very much sounds polytempo. In many ways, it is polytempo, but it's not as aggressively polytempo as the other movements, in that what's happening in Hourglass is there's really three tempo relationships that hold steady for the entire piece, and it's a 5/4/3 sort of stacked relationship. But when we performed, there was a premiere of the final four movements of the piece about a year ago, and when it was done live, the three movements leading up to it, all the ensemble needed to have click tracks, individual click tracks for each performer. But for the final movement, they all took out the click tracks, and the conductor came up and was able to just conduct it. So, but yeah, it's sort of it's a major culmination of what's happened in the piece up until that point.
Okay. Well, let's listen to the piece again. My guest is Brian Baumbusch. The release is called Polytempo Music, and this piece is called Hourglass. We're speaking with Brian Baumbusch. You can get more information about Brian's work at brianbaumbusch.com. Last name spelled Baumbusch. And we just listened to the piece Hourglass from the release Polytempo Music. The album is on Other Minds, and other formats, VR and apps are available through Brian's holograph. What is it?
Holography.
Holography.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Holography Records.
Holography Records. Um, we're running a little short on time, but I do want to get back to my introduction of you. It said that you what did I read there? Um, it said that your interests were in polytempo music and also in cross-cultural work, cross-cultural music, and that brings us to your release, Chemistry for Gamelan and String Quartet. The string quartet being the Jack Quartet. Um, and I just want to get a sense from you on, I don't know, gamelan music is intriguing for so many reasons, but I want to get your perspective on that. I want to play your track, your piece, Prisms for Gene Davis, Prism number one, subtitled Tetra, I guess. Um, and it's a short piece. We'll play that after the interview ends. But do you want to talk a little bit about your work in that area and how it came about,
Sure.
and also the collaboration between gamelan and string quartet, which is interesting in itself.
Sure. Well, you might not know this, Ken, but this being the MIT radio, the first piece I ever wrote for a gamelan ensemble was for the MIT
Yep,
gamelan ensemble run by Evans of Foreign.
sure.
At the time it was, and I wrote a piece for this set of electronic MIDI controller gamelan instruments, and we recorded it in their studio, which is right next to the media lab. So I have a long history. That was back in 2010, I believe. So I started studying gamelan music in the early 2000s. I've now been teaching Balinese gamelan music at UC Santa Cruz for 10 years, and throughout that time, and in part because Balinese culture is really open and really curious and really collaborative, I did a lot of composing and working with Balinese musicians, and I also started building my own instruments that were inspired by, but deviating in substantial ways from Balinese instruments. And about 2 years ago, I donated two full sets of these instruments I had built to a group in Bali, and we've recorded some of the music that I've written in the years since, and they've also written a lot of new music for those instruments. But this album, the Chemistry for Gamelan and String Quartet, was sort of the um, like the seminal album on those instruments once they got to Bali. So it was all commissioned through New World Records, and it was a big endeavor to send the instruments there. But yeah, Balinese music is one of the most virtuosic cultures of music, of sort of, let's call it, through composed orchestral music in the world. And certainly the culture of musicianship there is, I think, unparalleled from anything I've seen anywhere in the world. And it's a fascinating place to make music. And for me, it's really wonderful to be able to make music in Bali with Balinese musicians in a deeply social way, and have that be the counterpart to some of this very virtual work that I do, in polytempo music, and that relies on machines. Let's say
Mhm.
this music in no way relies on machines.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of fascinating, it's been fascinating to speak with you, and we appreciate you taking the time. And we're going to go out with this piece, Prisms for Gene Davis, Prism number one, Tetra, from the release on New World Records, Chemistry for Gamelan and String Quartet. My guest has been Brian Baumbusch. You can get more information at his website, brianbaumbusch.com. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Just thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be on the airwaves in Cambridge after all these years.
Yeah. Well, we're happy to have you on those airwaves, which of course you know, are accessible way beyond Cambridge for all kinds of reasons. But thanks so much, and we're going to go out with this piece. Have a good rest of your day, Brian.
All right, thanks, Ken.
We just heard, well, we heard an extensive interview with Brian Baumbusch, and but the most recent piece of music we heard was a piece titled "Chemistry for Gamelan and String Quartet," released by Brian Baumbusch on the New World label. I'm sorry, that's the name of the album, and the name of the piece was "Prisms for Gene Davis, Movement One, Prism One Tetra." Again, from the album Chemistry for Gamelan and String Quartet on New World. And before that, we heard the interview, including two pieces from Brian's release, Polytempo Music. On Other Minds, we heard Adzin and Hourglass.